So I am Gregor Bucher and I would like to talk a bit about how to write scientific publications, and in this part I would like to talk about the results. So the aim of the results section is that you convince the reader with your data. They should come to the same conclusion than you did when they have seen all your data. But how should you structure that? So there are at least two different ways. One is you present one result after the other, something like first we did this experiment, then we did that experiment, and then a third experiment. Or you use a second option, which is to put everything into small little units that answer specific questions. So question 1 was this, then we did that, and we found. And this is then the answer of that question. So given that these are two different ways of approaching that, and both are realized in publications, I wanted to know which one is probably the better one. In order to find out, I compared papers which I found well written compared to papers that I found rather confusing. And what I found is that good papers are mostly of the second type. So this one. So my conclusion, the second option is better. Then I wondered whether this would be a very subjective opinion or if this would be a more general view. In order to answer this question, I asked 10 colleagues about that, and I found that 7 agreed, 2 were undecided, and 1 did not respond. So again, the conclusion was the second option was quite generally supported. Finally, I wanted to know whether this option also is good for my specific work, and in order to find out, I took results from the lab and I structured them once in the one way and then in the second way, and I found that the paper with the second option really read much better, and when I submitted this for publication, it got quite good reviews and was published. So I conclude that using this second option helps in publishing. Okay, how should we structure the results section? I would like to go through this using this little results, what I've just presented you as an example. So what I did is always to first put the question. Here it's 2 options, this one or this one. Then I told you how I approached that. I compared papers. Then I told you the results and what I concluded from them. And this makes a small little section which first asks a question and then comes to the answer of this little question. And the same I did with this part. Again, first the question, then the approach, then the result, and then the conclusion, and again and again. Sometimes the conclusion already leads to the next question, and if this is the case, this of course is a very convincing way of leading from one section to the next one. So wherever this is possible, do it. Sometimes it doesn't work, but if you can do it, do it. The question is really important. So the reader needs to first know what you want to find out before he can judge whether the approach or the results are good. It can be a question, but it can also be alternative hypotheses. One way of structuring the results section in these little sections could be to have a little subheading for each of them or for subgroups of experiments, and the subheading would already have something like the main conclusion in it, like gene A is expressed in neurons rather than expression analysis of gene A. Some more facts about results. Remember, the aim is to convince the reader with your data. You should really not ask them to believe you, just take your word for it, but you really have to convince them. This is why you really have to work very hard on data presentation and the visualization of the data. You really have to help the reader in understanding your results. They should not need to really think a lot themselves. They should really have this presented in the best possible way by you. And then the reader should come to the same conclusion. So how should you order the results? So which experiment should be presented first and which one should be presented last? So you should probably not do it in the same sequence of events that you did it in the lab, but rather you should think of the reader and order them such that the reader can best understand. For instance, if your last experiment was a control experiment to see that the technique really works very well in your hands, then it may be historically your last experiment, but in the paper it should be one of the first ones, because the reader would really like to know if the experimental approach is valid. Sometimes there's a confusion what parts, what details of the method should be in the results section and what should go to the materials and methods. Essentially, all information that is required to judge your approach should be in the results section, but not more. For instance, it is important to know how many repetitions you did. It is important to know what statistical tests you used. These aspects I would put into the results. All the detailed parameters like the exact temperature and the exact parameters that you used in a certain analysis, this can then go to the materials and methods. So the reader, without going to the materials and methods section, should be able to judge your approach. All the rest goes to methods. A similar question often emerges with respect to what should go into results and what should go into the discussion. The conclusions, of course, contain already a bit of an interpretation of the results, and the interpretation should be largely confined to the discussion, but I think it's important to really do these small conclusions in the results section, but these should really be very brief and should be rather non-controversial conclusions. So the summary: the aim of the results section, you convince the reader with your data and they should reach to the same conclusions than you did. The structure: first you have to tell them what you are asking, what your question is, or what the alternative hypotheses are. Only then you explain the approach, the experimental design. Then the reader can decide whether this approach is really appropriate to answer that question, and then they will buy your results and also your conclusions. Before I leave, I would like to add another fun fact of the university, the Göttingen 7. So 100 years after the university was founded, another king was in power and he decided to retract liberal laws from the citizens. And 7 Göttingen professors didn't want to accept that, and they protested against that and expressed their concern of reducing the citizen laws again. Among them were famous people like the Brothers Grimm, you know them from the fairy tales. At the time it was not a good idea to criticize the king, so these 7 professors from Göttingen had to leave the university, and some even had to leave the country. It's really good that we are nowadays living in a country where we can criticize whomever we want. With that, I would like to leave you with writing your results section.